the cutting-edge technical tool that could save freedom of speech, and more importantly, save lives. The Defense Enabling Assistance Framework, or DEAF protection, has proven to be the state-of-the-art digital communications security technology, and is so powerful and stealthy that governments have gone to great lengths to protect it. Visit us at defprotection.com. That's defprotection.com.
If you are watching this video, then your curiosity has piqued in experiencing the most factual true crime series on YouTube. True Crime, Man's Dark Imagination. And now, here is your host, Alan Gautreaux.
Historians have maintained a certain skepticism when it came to incidents that occur as a result of some imaginary or supernatural creature. Taking a break from the usual fare presented on this channel, True Crime Man's Dark Imagination takes an historical journey through the world of lycanthropy, defined as a type of insanity and described by an ancient writer in which the patient imagined himself to be a beast and exhibited depraved appetites in accordance with the delusion. Through this profile, we will examine several murders that took place by persons who believed they were werewolves. Whether or not the act of assuming the identity of a werewolf is an act of insanity or a very real possibility, several famous and infamous cases occurred throughout history that illustrate this sickness with a tragic and mostly unfortunate result. In 1599, a French scholar, one Jean Beauvois de Chauvancourt, wrote a treatise entitled Discourse on Lycanthropy. The work traced the origins of werewolf legends and eyewitness accounts back to ancient times. This research actually caused some historians to confound themselves with which stories served as allegory, or was there some truth to the accounts. Needless to say, the lycanthrope had been traced throughout history as either being cursed with an affliction or an individual, man or woman, who made a bargain with Satan in order to gain some advantage in human life. But the question still remained: how could Satan transform a man, God's creation, into a hunter of man? This would be classified as a second creation, so to speak, and it would give Lucifer the upper hand, as he would have been able to destroy any creature in God's creation. In accepting this explanation, the devout Christians in the Middle Ages and later centuries in Europe would be seen as almost heretical, facing certain death themselves for this sacrilegious belief system. As stated previously in mentioning de Chauvancourt's work, legends of werewolves are scattered throughout history down through the ages, and one can see its origins back to ancient times when primitive man set out to domesticate animals, more specifically canines. Scholars relate the story that the famous Greek historian Herodotus of Narconissus wrote about in approximately 440 BC. At that time, he described a tribe of indigenous peoples in Scythia, now part of present-day Iran and Iraq, but also known as the Nuri, who performed the supernatural feat of transforming themselves into wolves for the purposes of ravaging nearby villages and consuming large quantities of human flesh. But this only happened once a year. In 400 BC, an Olympic boxer named Demarchus from the province of Parasia was said to have transformed himself into a wolf, returning to the form of a man after 9 years. In 37 BC, the Roman poet Virgil wrote in his book Eclogues of a person he observed named Morus, who turned into a wolf merely by using some secret herbs. Between 2 BC and 8 AD, Ovid wrote about the detailed transformation of a man into a wolf in his work, Metamorphosis. According to Ovid, supposedly, in approximately 1550 BC, a tale emerged from out of the Mediterranean regarding King Lycaon, who received a visit from the omnipotent Greek ruler of Mount Olympus, Zeus. When Zeus entered King Lycaon's court, the resting monarch refused to believe that the Almighty would actually come and visit him in person. So, in an attempt to draw out what the host believed to be an impostor, Lycaon fed his visitor human flesh at a banquet held in his honor. Zeus did not take kindly to Lycaon's behavior, especially when later Lycaon tried to murder Zeus in his sleep. The legend tells that the great god turned Lycaon into a werewolf, forever cursed to roam the earth as a dishonest and plotting creature with a taste for human flesh. Zeus did this because he reasoned that since Lycaon enjoyed serving human flesh to his banquet guests, why not make him a member of the pack that shared the same palates? In 60 AD, the Roman writer Petronius, in his work Satyricon, wrote the detailed account of a Roman soldier who could transform himself into a wolf at will, without atmospheric, barometric, or alchemaic assistance. Also in 60 AD, other tales emerged from this ancient period where the use of necromancy was used in order to achieve the desired likeness of a wolf. From this period on, starting with the arrival of Christianity into once pagan Europe, the werewolf legends emerged in earnest. The first mention of the word werewolf in the English language is said to have taken place in a text meant to document Christian laws in the 11th century. In the ecclesiastical ordinances of King Canute, the word man-wolf appeared as religious authorities at first characterized those who consumed human flesh as outlaws rather than something otherworldly. During one Yuletide feast in 1182 AD, the Welsh historian Giraldus Cambrensis reported that he encountered some Irish werewolves where the natives of the region stated that the two werewolves had been cursed by the 6th century Irish monk and saint, Saint Natalis, who bestowed upon the lycanthrope blasphemy for their wickedness. In a collection of stories by the Brothers Grimm, they wrote of an old German legend that deserves mention. A soldier's grandfather worked as a woodsman, and one day he went into the woods with a friend and a third man the grandfather had never met. Later that day, after working feverishly to cut down some trees, the third man suggested that they all take a short sleep and then resume their work. The grandfather decided that he would pretend to sleep, and he experienced a modicum of distrust regarding the third man. The third man went to the two men to make sure they were sleeping, and when satisfied that they were, he took off his belt and soon transformed into a werewolf. But the grandfather, in relating this story to his grandson, stated that the third man looked nothing like a real wolf, although he had some of the canine features generally associated with such a monster. The third man, after his transformation, then went to a nearby gully and attacked and ate a whole young foal. When the werewolf returned, he put the belt back on and resumed his human form. When the three men finally arose the next day, they journeyed to the gates of the local town, and the third man remarked that he had a bit of a stomach ache. The soldier's grandfather then whispered into the third man's ear that if he hadn't have eaten a whole horse. The Grimm's tale seemed more imaginary than based on eyewitnesses' accounts. It appeared that the storytellers had been quite active in regions that encompassed northern Europe than anywhere else. However, it also appeared that some of these legends took on the characteristics of particular local cultures while still maintaining the paralyzing terror that a being of this nature would have generated amongst indigenous populations. As in the Ovid rendition regarding King Lycaon, the Dutch believed that werewolves were punished people that warranted being cursed for some evil deed, while others, perhaps, were born that way. The reasons for the transformation into a wolf-like creature may vary from folklore to folklore, but some people actually believed that they had the power to exact their canine personalities upon will, and in doing just that, became the monsters moviegoers normally saw portrayed on the big screen. In history, there have been instances where some people have killed in the name of their lycanthropic misadventures, and most of the times documented. The victims were those hapless and more innocent than others, children. But these victims were not mutually exclusive, as reports about the lycanthropic behavior ran rampant through Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. Some attributed the ability to metamorphosize came with the steadfast belief and practice of Satanism. In 1502, in Poligny, France, in the northeastern part of the country near the Swiss border, a massive storm hit the area that played havoc with rain and wind. Many flocks of sheep scattered from the danger that Mother Nature visited upon the village. One shepherd, a man named Pierre Bugo, asked around for help to wrangle his flock. Just when Bugo had given up on any assistance with finding his lost sheep, 3 men, dressed all in black, including their horses, rode up to the shepherd and asked what difficulties he was having at the time. Bugo related that his sheep ran off as a result of the storm and he needed help finding them. One of the 3 men approached Bugo with a promise. He would find his lost sheep, he would be protected in the future and not have any more trouble with anyone, and he would receive money. All Bugo had to do was swear fealty to the man's master. Bugo thought for a moment and then said he had to think about it. 4 or 5 days later, when Bugo failed to find the rest of the sheep, he met with the dark men again. The shepherd learned that the man who made him the proposition was a servant of the devil himself. But Bugo, being desperate to find his sheep, swore allegiance to Satan and renounced his Christian faith. He kissed the dark man's left hand and described the experience as black and ice cold as that of a corpse. I fell to my knees and pledged my allegiance to Satan. For the next 2 years, Bugo served his master. With his flock protected, the shepherd soon tired of the life of worshiping Satan and leading the dark life as one of his minions on earth. Bugo resumed attending his local church. Then, a man named Michel Verdun approached Bugo and offered him money to revert to Satan worship. Bugo accepted the invitation, and the two then went into the woods where they performed some sort of ritual where they would forever possess the ability to transform into wolves. Bugo described the ritual. In a wood near Chassel-Charnon, we met with others whom I did not recognize. We danced, and each had his or her green taper with a blue flame. Still under the delusion that I should obtain money, Michel persuaded me to move with greatest celerity, and in order to do this, after I had stripped myself, he smeared me with a salve, and I believed myself to be transformed into a wolf. I was, at first, somewhat horrified at my 4 wolf's feet and the fur with which I was covered all at once, but I found that I could now travel with the speed of the wind. Bugo stated that he believed that the power of the devil commanded his transformation and that Lucifer himself was present at the celebration. The shepherd also claimed that Verdun transformed as well, after applying the ointment himself, and subsequent to their individual metamorphoses, they hunted for years after the ceremony. During one incident, Bugo allegedly found a boy of 5 or 6 and desired to kill and eat him. Instead, the young child screamed so loudly that it deterred Bugo from his intentions, and he ran away, quickly smearing the ointment about his body and changing back into a man. In their hunting sojourns, Bugo and Verdun captured a woman who gathered peas in a field, stripping her of her flesh and then consuming the meat. They also killed the man who tried to save her as well. On another occasion, they found a 4-year-old girl alone at a farm and tore her to pieces, leaving only an arm unconsumed. Bugo remarked that Verdun found human flesh most tasty and seemed as though they became more and more insatiable as their behavior continued. On other occasions, they murdered a 9-year-old girl, drinking her blood, while in human form, Bugo strangled another young girl, snapping her neck. He then attacked a goat and bit its throat, later resorting to finally ending the animal's misery by cutting its throat with a knife. In 1521, after almost 20 years of wholesale slaughter, authorities captured Verdun when he bled from a wound that his wife tried to dress after an attack. Immediately, authorities tortured Verdun, and he gave up the names of Bugo and another man, Philbert Monteau. When Bugo confessed, Verdun corroborated every detail in his statement. In December of that year, the defendants faced trial and were found guilty. All 3 men were burnt at the stake for their alleged crimes. As history demonstrated, the legacy of the werewolf continued with reckless abandon, and those who researched the phenomenon attached the supernatural element. At the time, especially in Europe, people began to back away from the church, and ecclesiastical authorities searched for a reason as to this exodus. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, the search for witches, vampires, and werewolves brought a sort of hysteria to the region, where even England declared a witch-finder general, one Matthew Hopkins. On the continent, werewolves were seen as the epitome of evil, along with the witches, vampires, and other supernatural creatures. In 1573, several children went missing in the French village of Roulet. Subsequently, these children turned up dead and, strangely, half-eaten. Authorities in the village had received reports of a large wolf in the vicinity and issued an order to hunt the creature down and kill it. On one particular night, a small group of villagers happened across a young boy attempting to escape what appeared to be a large wolf. The villagers came to the rescue of the boy, and the wolf ran into the woods around the town. When the wolf ran off, he transformed in mid-stride, and the villagers recognized him as one Gilles Garnier. Garnier had been characterized as a hermit who lived away from Roulet and isolated himself along with his wife. The villagers surmised that the attacks and mutilations of children did not actually begin until Garnier's arrival. Other villagers believed in the more practical assessment of the creature when they happened upon Garnier in human form, attempting to eat a child. Subsequently, authorities arrested Garnier and charged him with the murders and other mutilations in the area. Undoubtedly, officials tortured Garnier to abstract a confession, which proved successful with his admissions that he murdered and ate the flesh of children. The court found Garnier guilty of witchcraft, lycanthropy, and murder, and sentenced him to death by burning at the stake. In the late 16th century, in the town of Bedburg, located in the electorate of Cologne, Germany, what can only be described as a hound from hell, the town had been experiencing cattle mutilations, murdered women, and mutilated children. The corpses had been all found with a substantial amount of grotesque physical injuries, including but not limited to having their throats ripped open and their bodies cannibalized, somehow ravaged by a wild animal. The difficulty with finding such a creature stemmed from the religious leaning of the countryside at the time. Catholicism and Protestantism seemed at constant war, and Bedburg always seemed in the middle of any conflicts that erupted as a result of the European theocratic rule. Furthermore, this region also saw its share of resurgences of the Black Death, which had decimated Europe some 200 years before. But with the emergence of the cattle mutilations, the deaths of women and children in the area, local residents believed something almost supernatural to be at work in this tiny corner of the world. Although local farmers suspected the work of a wolf when the cattle attacks first occurred, their mindsets changed rapidly as children began to disappear from their farms and homes. Some were found dead, and others bore the marks of senseless mutilation, and some were never found at all. But then others believed that the killer walked among them, a werewolf, a shapeshifter. Well, they were not entirely wrong. One of their own was certainly responsible, but most of the townspeople refused to believe the identity of the culprit at first. Peter Stuba, or Stumpf, or Abel Griswold, or Ubel Griswold, came from a wealthy family and certainly did not exhibit the behavior attributed to a werewolf. Stuba was actually a widower with 2 adolescent children who garnered a certain amount of respect due to his wealth and the way he carried himself, in human form anyway. But at night, when he thought no one was looking or would notice, the mild-mannered widower donned a wolfskin, and of course a belt that would help him transform, much like the story rendered through Ovid, and satisfied an insatiable bloodlust upon his neighbors. Stuba was once described in his alter ego as strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body and mighty paws. Once he removed the belt, Stuba actually believed he returned to a normal man. To put it simply, Stuba was merely a serial killer and used the wolf skin as a disguise and the belt as a cover for his nocturnal activities. When all totaled, Stuba murdered 13 children, 2 pregnant women, and countless other animals. Interestingly, the young women he accosted had been sexually assaulted before he tore them to pieces. Allegedly, he tore the fetuses from the pregnant women and ate their hearts, panting and raw. Some of the small children he strangled, bludgeoned, and tore their throats open with his bare hands. Some of the victims had been disemboweled and partially consumed. In one instance, Stuba murdered 3 people walking at night, 2 men and a woman. Fortunately, one child did manage to escape his clutches while playing in a meadow with several of his friends. Stuba ran after them in the dead of night, scaring most of them off except this one young girl. Because of the stiff collar the girl wore at the time, Stuba proved unable to rip through the garment to her throat. The frightened little girl thought quickly and took the chance to escape from Stuba. She cried out as loud as she could, which startled the cows, who feared for the safety of their calves at this point, charged at Stuba, causing him to release the girl. None of the children, especially the one whom Stuba singled out, could identify their attacker. No one, even his family, were safe from Stuba. Historical accounts demonstrated that Stuba had incestuous relationships with his sister and his daughter. While engaging in this deviant behavior, Stuba impregnated his daughter, and when she gave birth to his firstborn son, when the child was old enough to walk, Stuba led the little boy into the forest, murdered him, then allegedly ate his brains. Even if the werewolf allegations had not surfaced against this fiend, he would have been considered a monster by any sane contemporary. Stuba believed steadfastly in his invincibility due to the power of the magic belt he possessed. But when the severed and half-eaten limbs of townspeople began to appear, this only convinced the denizens of the town that an evil, flesh-consuming creature of the devil had made its way into their midst. One of these hunting parties soon followed the scent of some dogs brought in for the purpose of finding the animal. As they searched all day long, trusting that the canines had finally had the much-hated werewolf, they finally cornered what they thought was a werewolf in a small clearing in the woods. But when the hunting party reached the clearing, all they found was Peter Stuba cowering away from them. The hunter stood there in disbelief as they questioned whether this upstanding citizen, by most outstanding appearances, changed from a man to beast and murdered their own townspeople. Stuba was arrested for the various murders that took place in as many months. After his arrest, as was common practice in those days, authorities tortured Stuba and he admitted to the various mutilations and murders throughout the countryside. The suspected werewolf also admitted to sorcery, consortium with the devil, and his faith in the magic belt. On October 28, 1589, the court found Stuba guilty and pronounced his sentence, death. But the manner in which the court determined Stuba to die became more gruesome than anything he may have done to his victims. His body was strapped spread-eagle on a large wheel. With red-hot pincers, his executioners pulled his flesh from his bones in 10 spots. His arms and legs were broken with a large axe. His head was then cut off. Upon the large wheel, authorities placed 16 long pieces of wood attached to the wheel with leather to represent the known 16 victims of the murderer. On the following Halloween, 3 days after the suspected werewolf's execution, his daughter and mistress were brought to the town square, where the executioner beheaded them and then burned their bodies at the stake. It was thought at the time that the two women aided and abetted Stuba's crimes, and therefore had to suffer the same fate. The local magistrate made sure that the news of Stuba's execution reached far and wide. Pamphlets were circulated as a warning to all Satan worshippers that the same fate awaited them if they did not return to God. In 1598, a young girl ravaged the countryside near Jura, France, while on all fours, believing she was a wolf. During one of her outings, the young girl suddenly felt a bloodlust and attacked another little girl. Her brother, only 4 years old, went after the attacker with a knife. The wolf girl wrestled the knife away from the boy, slashing his throat and killing him. The little girl managed to escape. Soon, a hunting party from the village hunted the young wolf girl and mutilated her corpse as a warning to others who believed they were infected with lycanthropy. The young girl who succumbed to her canine desires was identified as Pernay Grandillon, whose family resided in the area. Once the young girl had been killed, her brother, Pierre Grandillon, was soon charged with witchcraft and imprisoned for the accusation. The authorities at the time believed that Pierre lured young children into the woods to murder and mutilate them, and running about the countryside having transformed himself into a wolf. A later confession disclosed that Pierre used a salve that began the metamorphosis. A salve, some claimed, Pierre received from the devil himself. In one transformation, according to Pierre, he became a hare and not a wolf. Pierre claimed that he slaughtered animals and humans, and when he wanted to transform back into a man, he would roll around in dewy grass. Pierre's son, Georges, also admitted that he would turn into a wolf and traipse the countryside. Georges admitted to officials from the village that he slaughtered 2 goats on one of his sojourns. It seemed that the whole family had made bargains with the Dark One, as Georges' sister, Antoinette, confessed to being a black she-goat, having submitted herself to Lucifer. History records that Pierre and Georges went to a local prison where they were interrogated, most probably tortured, and they soon began acting like they belonged in an asylum. The 2 men would run around their cells on all fours, and officials noted that both men bore horrendous scars all over their arms and legs that allegedly occurred as a result of the villagers hunting them in an attempt to stop the mutilations. Religious scholar Sabine Bringoult related in the 19th century that without the salves, Pierre and Georges could not transform. Pierre, Georges, and Antoinette Grandillon were hanged and then burned at the stake. Also in 1598, a mild-mannered tailor stood accused of luring children into his tailor shop, slaying them, and then eating their flesh. His list of victims had been lost to history, but when his shop had been searched, the authorities discovered a cask full of bones, and when he finally came to trial, the judges deemed his actions so horrific that they ordered the entire transcript burned. In the same year as the execution of the Grandillon family and the discovery of the Tailor of Chalon, another werewolf surfaced near Caude, one of the small hamlets in rural France. A small group of men were walking through the woods and spotted two wolves that appeared to be dismembering their newest kill. What they happened upon was the body of a 15-year-old boy who had obviously been attacked by the wolves. The furred creatures ran swiftly from the area after the party came upon them. After leaving some men with the dying boy, the other men in the party gave chase, following the blood trail left by the wolves. Once they lost the scent, some men rested in a small clearing. One of the searchers noticed a young man, bearded, out of breath, and half naked, hiding behind a bush. His hands appeared stained with blood. Later, the half-naked man had been identified as one Jacques Roulet, a beggar who often went into the town asking for money or food. Once confronted by authorities, Roulet confessed that he came upon the boy earlier that day and prepared to devour the entire corpse. But he was interrupted by the party of men walking through the woods. When brought before the court, Roulet admitted that he was able to transform himself into a wolf by means of a salve which his parents had given him. When the judges queried as to the two wolves who were left to be with the boy, Roulet stated that he knew them as his brother John and their cousin Julien. Roulet was immediately remanded to custody until a trial could be conducted. Later, a court found the beggar guilty and sentenced him to death. But instead of just waiting to see his sentence carried out, Roulet appealed to a higher court in Paris, France, and they commuted his sentence to 2 years in an insane asylum. History lost track of Roulet after his release. The werewolf legends and sightings spread through Europe as the Christian Church sought desperately to explain why their membership steadily declined during this period in history. To the clerics, there could be only one explanation. Satan worshippers have made their propositions more desirable to the poor peasant farmers across the continent. If parishioners were to return to their spiritual roots, the werewolves had to be eradicated. In 1685, in the small principality of Ansbach, Germany, villagers heard rumors of a large wolf attacking cattle, sheep, and other farm animals over some months. Quickly, the rumor started to be accepted as fact that a werewolf had been stalking the area, and pretty soon the creature would become bored with the livestock and move to humans. And this finally occurred where several children lost their lives to the beast. Locals believed that they knew the identity of the werewolf, stating that the former mayor of Ansbach, a Michael Leicht, subjected his patrons to the most cruel and unusual punishments as the resident king of the province. Leicht had recently died, and citizens believed he escaped death by transferring his spirit from a human body into that of a wolf. Denizens firmly believed that this once tormentor had returned to wreak havoc as a dark creature serving the Black Lord. The hunt for the wolf became a twofold mission. One was to protect the children from any further attacks and mutilations. The other, to rid themselves of what appeared to be a godless ruler who returned in the form of a canine spirit, again to rule over his people with a more mortal fear. Being as Ansbach contained a good many hunters, they decided that the only way they could entrap the animal was to use what they called a Wolfsgrube, or wolf pit. The wolf pit contained a hole lined with stones approximately 9 to 12 feet deep and covered with branches, twigs, and straw. The villagers sought to tempt the animal with a sheep, pig, or a goose. The wolf would then smell the prey, smelling around the straw and branches, eventually falling into the pit. Instead of one of the larger farm animals as bait, the trappers decided on a rooster. Once the wolf approached the pit, he sniffed somewhat, then attempted to grab the rooster out of the pit. Thereupon, the trappers immediately ended the beast with sharp instruments and some rudimentary firearms. Once the animal had been dispatched, The trappers dragged the bloodied carcass through the center of town to display it to the citizens that the danger was over. They then skinned the wolf's carcass, severed its muzzle, and placed a mask resembling the former mayor on the head. They then dressed the corpse in a wig and a cloak, hanging it from a gibbet on a nearby hill where anyone coming near the village could view it. From a spiritual sense, the townspeople, in draping the wolf's body with human features, signified to Satan that they would no longer be fooled with his tricks. It served as a warning to the Dark Lord himself. Conversely, it also served as a political warning to those who would subject citizens that he ruled to harsh conditions that his fate had been predetermined to hang where his body could be seen. Clearly, although lycanthropy had been seen as fairy tales and the stories of superstitious individuals, this case proved that blind mass hysteria was no longer considered an insane process, but rather a representation of the thinking of those who saw evil in many forms. One of the most celebrated cases of its time occurred around the year 1692 in Livonia, now part of Estonia in Baltic Europe. A man named Theis was placed on trial for idolatry and the belief that, as a werewolf, he was destined to go to heaven. Theis's belief stemmed from the allegation that he became a werewolf to fight off an epidemic of witches in that part of Europe. The accused stated that he and a group of others were enlisted by men of God to fight the scourge of witchcraft which had plagued Europe for centuries. Even under pain of torture from an inquisition, Theis refused to state that he and the others made a pact with the devil in order to achieve their shape-shifting abilities. Theis then went on to refuse to see the parish priest, whom the authorities hoped could refute Theis's claims. Unbelievably, the court only sentenced Theis to 10 lashes with the whip, since no evidence existed that he and the others committed any crimes that were so prevalent in earlier cases of lycanthropy. Theis's confession proved equally interesting to the panel of judges at his trial. The convicted werewolf stated that he and the other werewolves changed into their beast form 3 times a year in order to visit hell, on St. Lucia's Day, the Pentecost, and St. John's Day. Furthermore, Theis confessed that in addition to fighting witches, he and his cohorts battled wizards and made sure that local farmers had a good harvest. Claiming they were the hounds of God, Theis stressed that without the werewolves battling the witches and evil forces that could cripple a farmer's ability to produce a profitable crop, the region would be laid barren. In the rural region of Gévaudan, France, between the years 1764 and 1767, approximately 100 men, women, and children were victims of La Bête de Gévaudan, the Beast of Gévaudan. The beast was first sighted when a young woman tending cattle near Langon, France, thought she saw a ferocious animal that resembled a large dog with fiery red eyes staring intently on some of the animals in the herd that she tended to that day. On June 30th, 1764, historians have attributed the animal's first attack of a young 14-year-old girl, Jean Boulet, to this alleged werewolf. Boulet tended to some sheep when the animal appeared and struck her without warning, killing her instantly by tearing out her throat. It is said that the attacker later feasted on some of her body as well. But since that documentation, historians noted that 2 months prior to the ambush on Boulet, a young woman claimed to have been attacked by a similar creature, which she characterized as like a wolf, yet not a wolf. The young woman managed to survive the attack because it appeared the herd of cattle protected her and somehow chased the attacker away. The attacks continued throughout that summer and into the fall of 1764. The French had recently lost the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in the English colonies of North America, and it seemed that the beast became a distraction from the deplorable ways that Louis XV had been running the country at the time. Women and children were not the only ones who suffered from the attacks of this animal. Men also were victims, and reports detailed how lone men suffered from vicious and swift attacks by something they described as a wolf, yet not a wolf. The attacks became so frequent that citizens of the country believed there were two wolves at work. The new description of the werewolf became bête féroce, or ferocious beast, with unusual red fur streaked with black. The citizens of the French countryside did not sit idly by while this marauding monster took the plains and valleys in search of human flesh. Local constabularies offered bounties for the wolf or wolves, and hunting parties searched the countryside looking for the beast. On October 8, 1764, only a few hours after a fatal attack, the werewolf depicted as the beast had been seen outside of the Château de la Baume, where the animal appeared to be looking for its next prey. The resilience of the animal took on more of a supernatural aura, as when the hunting party finally cornered the animal in a clearing, it appeared to have hit him or her with a large volley of musket shot. After the animal hit the ground, it rose again and ran into the safety of the woods. The hunters noticed that a mortal creature could not have sustained such gunshot and still survived, much less been able to arise and run back into the woods from which it came. Even children were moved to action when one day the alleged werewolf attacked a group of 7 children, ages 8 to 12, walking near a tree line. One of the children, 10-year-old Jacques Portefeuille, scared the animal off with a large pointed stick. King Louis XV allegedly rewarded the boy for his heroism with an education paid for by the crown. On August 11, 1765, a young girl, Marie-Jeanne Vallée, armed with only an old bayonet attached to a pole, defended herself and her younger sister against an animal matching the descriptions of the beast held at the time. When the animal came upon the young girls, Marie held out the bayonet and the animal charged, forcing Marie to pierce the animal's large chest. It then ran off as swiftly as it attacked. Marie Vallée soon became known as the Maid of Gévaudan for her bravery against the beast that day. When news of the actions of the children that day reached King Louis XV, it prompted him to act by sending the royal hunters to the area to kill the beast. Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine Vaumille de Noval and Jean-François, both professional hunters, went to Gévaudan and the surrounding regions to hunt the beast. When the hunters returned with 3 large gray wolves, they claimed one of them to be the animal perpetrating the attacks. Again, the attacks continued soon thereafter. On September 20th, 1765, François Antoine, the elderly gun-bearer of Louis XV, and his nephew shot and killed a large wolf outside of the Abbaye at Chazé. Because of the size of the wolf, people naturally assumed that this old man and his nephew got lucky and bagged the animal that terrorized the French countryside for the last year. The king rewarded Antoine with money and title, with the animal being stuffed and put on display. However, the wolf attacks began again in December of that year, and this werewolf showed no fear when it came to the cattle it encountered. Was this a second, more vicious beast than the first, or was it the same one who merely adapted its behavior? The attacks continued unabated for another 2 years, until finally they increased in frequency, and another hunting party had been organized in early June 1767. The Marquis d'Apcher led the hunting party around Gévaudan, and on June 19th, a local man named Jean Chastel shot a large wolf on the slopes of Mount Mouchet. Most historians believe that the frequency with which the attacks occurred, that there had to have been more than one wolf involved. In fact, one historian, Jean-Marc Morisseau, discovered that over 7,600 alleged wolf attacks resulted in deaths of the victims and occurred between 1362 and 1918 in France alone. One interesting facet of the story of the Beast of Gévaudan is that the animal killed by Chastel was necropsied, and what the morticians found, the animal's stomach contained the remains of human body parts. Throughout the historical record, one can see that werewolf trials took place all over Europe for approximately 200 years. Some of the penalties, as we have seen in the Stuba case, were harsh, while others barely received a slap on the wrist. Perhaps this depended on the area where the offenses took place and how close the local population may have been to their Christian parish churches. Or, perhaps, it is all just a matter of hysteria that broke free from those who chose to question the existence of God. This draws a larger question. Can a human change his or her form to hunt other humans when confronted with the insatiable hunger for human flesh? Or are we strictly dealing with mental illness so deep that even the most educated psychological professional cannot discern whether the patient suffers from a mental disorder, or they can actually assume the form of a half-man or half-woman and half-wolf? Or is it just a ruse to hide the cravings for human flesh? Over the centuries, we as a society have characterized those who became, in the erstwhile sense, just cannibals as werewolves. Throughout this channel, such individuals such as Fritz Haarmann, Albert Fish, Karl Grossmann, Karl Denke, Joachim Kroll, and of course, the legendary Sonny Bean, have all consumed human flesh. But never did they mention that they bathed at a full moon, nor did they change shape to commit their crimes. Do werewolves exist? Perhaps there is a cryptid creature out there that may resemble a large wolf, but was this the result of a man or woman metamorphosizing using a salve or a magic belt? Or is it just in their minds? Until next time. Hello everyone, this is Alan Gotro, your host of True Crime Man's Dark Imagination. If you would like to support our channel, you can become a member of Subscribestar. There are different levels, and subscribers get special privileges. Also, we do have a PayPal account. If you enjoy our work here, please think about subscribing. I will leave the links below in the comment section. We thank you very much for your viewing, and please stay tuned for future programs.